Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight as we proudly welcome and debut our new curator of collections, Dr. Nicole Williams. Before we get to Nikki's presentation, I just wanted to let you know and ask you to please stay tuned to our email updates as we will soon be announcing more lectures in the coming weeks. We will continue our examination of the Gilded Age from its many angles. And we hope that you have enjoyed our series so far as we examine the origins and influences of the period, which Nikki will continue this evening. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, my name is Leslie Jones, and I'm the Director of Museum Affairs and Chief Curator for the Preservation Society. This evening, we will be having a Q&A portion of the program following the conclusion of Nikki's presentation. So if you could please use the Q&A feature on Zoom, you can pose your questions there, both during and after Nikki's remarks. So on to an introduction of our speaker. Nikki joined the Preservation Society in January of 2022, so she is very new to us, just over a month ago. And I have to say that as part of the interview process, Nikki stood out immediately, and it has been an absolute joy to work with her. We're very lucky to have her here in Newport, and you will soon experience that as well this evening. She was most recently a postdoctoral teaching fellow and honorary guest scholar at Washington University in St. Louis in the Department of Art History and Archaeology, where she curated the exhibition which holds the same name as our evening's lecture, Global Vistas, American Art and Internationalism in the Gilded Age. The exhibition was supposed to be on view, but of course, as we know, COVID canceled a lot of our plans. So rather than it being installed at the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum, it is a virtual experience that you too can enjoy. So I encourage you to visit the Washington University website and view the exhibition. Nikki has worked with various esteemed collections, including the Harvard Art Museums, Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and Yale University Art Gallery. She received her BA from Harvard in 2009 with a degree in the history of art and architecture. And then she went on to receive both her MA and PhD from Yale University in the history of art with a specialty in the Gilded Age. So there is no better source for you this evening. So please help me welcome Nikki Williams. Nikki.
Thanks so much, Leslie, and thanks so much for inviting me to speak today. Before I begin, I just wanted to say how much I've enjoyed my first few weeks in Newport. I arrived here in January, as Leslie mentioned, and in the last month or so, I've begun the extremely exciting process of acquainting myself with the collections, which include treasures from all around the world. So many Newport families during the Gilded Age had worldwide business and social connections, and they also cultivated a very cosmopolitan outlook. My recent work has focused on this global perspective of American artists and consumers. Also, as Leslie mentioned, before I arrived in Newport, I was teaching at Washington University in St. Louis, where I had the chance to curate an exhibition at the university's Kemper Art Museum called Global Vistas, American Art and Internationalism in the Gilded Age. The exhibit is available at virtually at the URL on your screen. Global Vistas explores the importance of international travel and exchange to American art of the Gilded Age, which is a term we use to refer to the period roughly between the Civil War and World War I. This period saw the rise of global trade, a boom in international tourism, massive waves of immigration to the US, and also the escalation of American imperialism as the US began to flex its power abroad, occupying territories as far-flung as the Philippines and Panama. I decided to organize Global Vistas around what I found to be 5 key sites in the period psyche. And these are places that Americans at the time considered to be extremely important, whether for political reasons or economic reasons or social or even spiritual reasons. They included Venice, Japan, medieval England, the Holy Land, which meant the lands of the Bible, and Panama. So I thought what I might do today is take you on a whirlwind global tour by looking closely at objects from each of these places, including highlights from the Global Vistas exhibit, and also objects from our Newport mansions. These will be works that have leapt to my attention since I arrived here in Newport. But before we take off on that global tour, I wanted to begin within the Victorian home, which is where all travel preparations begin. You're looking at a stereoscope in the library at Chateau-sur-Mer, one of our properties here in Newport. In the Gilded Age, there was a stereoscope in nearly every middle and upper class home in America. It was a popular form of parlor entertainment. A stereoscope was a viewing apparatus that allowed you to look at a two-dimensional photograph and see that scene in 3 dimensions with a depth that simulated real-world experience. A paper card known as a stereo card or a stereograph would be slotted into one end of the device. And on that card were 2 nearly identical photographs that had been taken at slightly different angles that approximated the distance between your eyes. So when you viewed those 2 photographs through the stereoscope, what happened was the 2 images suddenly resolved into a single picture seen in spatial depth. On the left, I'm showing you a stereograph with 2 photographs depicting the pyramids at Giza, a major tourist destination during the Gilded Age. And on the right, you see what that same card would have looked like, transformed through the magic of the stereoscope. The picture's 3-dimensionality on the right gives you the sense that you're actually standing at the paws of the Sphinx. So the stereoscope let you imaginatively travel from the comfort of your armchair. It's not surprising then that the most popular subjects for stereophotography during the Gilded Age were views of foreign landscapes and cultures. Millions of middle and upper class consumers during the Gilded Age had their worlds blown wide open by stereophotography. I thought that I would begin with the stereoscope because it exemplifies how Gilded Age Americans were enjoying unprecedented access to global vistas thanks to the wonders of modern technology. There were many more technological developments in this period that ushered in an era of global connectedness. Improvements to communication and transportation networks enabled more Americans to travel abroad. We had the laying of the first transatlantic telegraph cable along the route you see here, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, and the opening of the Suez Canal. In 1867, regular steamship service commenced between San Francisco and Yokohama, Japan. Young American artists were flocking to study in Europe's great art centers, often staying overseas for many years and establishing vibrant expatriate communities. Back home, increased commerce made available to domestic consumers a dazzling variety of global goods. The outrageous fortunes of American business titans like J.P. Morgan caricatured here gave elite US collectors the means to hoover up the spoils of Europe. And we can't forget the great World's Fairs in cities like Chicago, where visitors could admire arts and manufactures from all around the world. They could glide on a Venetian gondola in a man-made canal, and they could watch Egyptian belly dancers gyrate all in an afternoon. World's Fairs stoked visitors' fantasies about other people and places, and they also encouraged American artists and manufacturers to integrate diverse foreign influences. American art and design in the Gilded Age became eclectic and international in style. The American novelist Henry James mused, "We can deal freely with forms of civilization not our own, can pick and choose and assimilate, and in short, claim our property wherever we find it." So what he's saying is, let's appropriate global arts to create our own national style. And he's specifically talking about art and literature. I think that James's eagerness to appropriate the work of other cultures should also be seen in the context of the imperial ambitions of the US in this period, because it's at this time that America indeed began to claim the world as its property. America was establishing itself as a global power. It gained control over the Philippines and other territories after the Spanish-American War. It annexed Hawaii. It completed the conquest of Plains Indian tribes in North America. And it gained total control over the Panama Canal Zone. And we'll see on our tour that an imperial sensibility colored how Americans viewed the world. On our tour, though, I want to highlight the agency of foreign artists and merchants who helped to shape American ideas. Foreign artists and merchants actively constructed their cultures for an American audience, and they often did so in strategic ways that advanced their own political and economic interests. So even in imperial or colonizing situations in which America was laying claim to other countries, Native artists managed to turn those encounters to their own ends. And this is what I mean when I use the term cultural exchange in the Gilded Age. The word exchange captures the idea of a give and take. American artists and collectors were appropriating the styles and goods and materials of other cultures. But those cultures were also looking back at us. They were interpreting our intentions abroad. They were strategizing about how they could shape our experiences in ways that were profitable for them. So with this structuring idea of cultural exchange in mind, I think we're ready to take off on our global journey. I want to take you first to Venice, a city then known as La Serenissima, meaning the most serene. I'm showing you a luminous painting called Venetian Sails, completed in 1873 by American artist Sanford Robinson Gifford. Gifford painted this picture in his New York studio from sketches he made on his second summer sojourn to Venice in 1869. Though it doesn't show in Gifford's painting, Venice was already attracting hordes of American tourists by that date. Americans were enticed to visit by rapturous accounts of the city that had recently appeared in art and literature. Most influential was the English critic John Ruskin's widely read 3-volume study of Venetian art and architecture titled The Stones of Venice. Ruskin's work was published in the early 1850s, but remained crucial reading throughout the Gilded Age for anyone interested in art and architecture. Ruskin, as I'm sure many of you know, was a big critic of England's Industrial Revolution. And in The Stones of Venice, he described the island city as a refuge from modern industrial forces. Ruskin's text popularized an idea of Venice as miraculously crystallized in a lost pre-industrial age. And this view of the city really struck a chord with Americans, because the US was also rapidly industrializing in this period, and many worried about the environmental and social consequences of industrialization, like the destruction of America's pastoral landscapes and the influx of millions of immigrant workers who came to tend the nation's factories. Many American visitors to Venice wanted to find there a soothing refuge from modern industrial life. Gifford's painting captures this pre-industrial ideal of Venice. We see large, brightly colored fishing boats drifting across the placid lagoon. These are very primitive lateen sailboats, in contrast to the massive ocean liners that would have chugged American tourists across the Atlantic. So they imply that the city is stuck in time. And if you look closely at their sails, notice how they're not even catching the breeze. The sails are basically hanging slack, and the boats are really just bobbing in place. They're not, engaging in active commerce. And I think this creates a pervasive sense of stagnation. The message is that Venice is a city that's stuck in place. But of course, we know that wasn't the case, because I mentioned that Venice by this point was clamoring with tourists, and the traffic of steamships and vaporetti, which were those big public water buses that transported tourists around the lagoon. And Gifford was also producing these paintings as tourist souvenirs. He actually painted dozens of very similar scenes for wealthy patrons who traveled to Venice. For example, this is his earlier painting, The Lagoons of Venice, which he basically just copied and then reversed to create the painting Venetian Sails. Gifford was like a painting machine. He was, churning out picture after picture of Venice, always focusing on the lagoon, often painting the paintings at the same scale with the same horizon line and very, very similar sailboats. So while Gifford is making Venice look like it's untouched by modern industrial forces, he's also painting paradoxically in a quasi-industrial way. In other words, his commercial repetition of Venetian scenes, this churning out of pictures of Venice, evokes industry's new rhythms of mass production. It's interesting to me that souvenir photographs of Venice sold to tourists by Venetian photographers also pictured Venice as a pre-modern place, even while the camera itself was a very modern technology in this period. Photography was only invented in the 1830s, 1840s. You're looking at a hand-colored souvenir photograph by Venetian photographer Giovanni Battista Brusa. It shows two famous palazzos on a picturesque sweep of the canal. We see the Palazzo Faro on your right and the Palazzo Contarini Fasan on the left. Both of these structures had been praised by Ruskin for their beautiful Gothic architecture. The Palazzo Contarini Fasan also was believed to be the home of Shakespeare's Desdemona, which made it a must-see for learned travelers. Venetian photographers like Brusa focused on recording the city's historic art and architecture and its picturesque aquatic views, while like Gifford, they also minimized the modern aspects of Venetian life. And you can see that if you look at the far left of Bruce's photograph, you'll notice just jutting into the scene, there's just a sliver of a modern hotel signboard. And this would have been the signpost for the Hotel New York, which catered to wealthy American businessmen. It was actually one of the busiest hotels in Europe during the Gilded Age. Brusa frames his picture to minimize this sign, literally, of 19th century life, because he knows tourists want to see a dream like Venice that's undisturbed by modernity. I want to briefly look at two more Venetian scenes by American painter and stained glass artist David Maitland Armstrong. They hang right here in Newport at Kingscote because Armstrong's son Edward married Gwendolyn King. We see on the left a local woman fishing water out of a well in some obscure section of town. And on the right, we see a narrow alley that leads towards a humble vendor. He's probably roasting chestnuts, which was a traditional Venetian street food. Notice how both pictures are extremely dark and shadowy, as if Armstrong has self-consciously avoided depicting the city's famous light. Armstrong also seems to have intentionally avoided the typical tourist sites like the sparkling lagoon as depicted by Gifford or the beautiful palazzos we saw in Bruce's photograph. Armstrong instead gives us slivers of life off the beaten path. And that's why I really love these two pictures. Armstrong is trying to have a more authentic encounter with Venetian culture. Armstrong at this point was also still in his early 30s. He's quite a young artist and he's trying to find his own voice. And we see that here in the fact that he's refused to conform to the typical views of the tourist. I think about these pictures as evidence of a young artist beginning to cultivate a singular and a nonconformist voice, a nonconformist vision. Before we move to our next destination, I just wanted to add that historical Venetian art and architecture was also attracting the interest of Newport collectors during the Gilded Age. For the hall and dining room at the Elms, for example, Edward Berwind purchased Venetian paintings, including these four depicting episodes in the life of Roman general Scipio africanus. They were taken from a 15th century Venetian home. And this is Antonio Pellegrini's allegorical painting, Minerva and Immortality, originally from the library of the Palazzo Pisani, but now on the ceiling of Alva Vanderbilt's bedroom at Marble House. It's possible that Newport collectors thought of themselves as a new American nobility to rival the old Venetian patricians who originally commissioned and owned these pictures. So buckle your seatbelts. We're off to Japan. I'm showing you a delightful woodblock print from the Preservation Society's collection at Kingscote. This work was completed in 1860 by Japanese printmaker Utagawa Yoshikazu, and it shows the games of foreign children, meaning the children of American and European merchants who were brand new residents of Japan in this period. In 1853, the American Commodore Matthew Perry had led a Navy squadron to Japan that forced the country to open to Western trade, ending more than 250 years of isolationist policies under the feudal rule of the Tokugawa shogunate. Americans and Europeans began to settle and do business in Japan in the 1850s and 60s. And their strange looks and customs immediately fascinated the Japanese. Realized that most Japanese people had never seen Westerners before. So Japanese artists like Yoshikazu began to make prints depicting these strange newcomers to feed that local curiosity. Here, Yoshikazu pictures American or European children, identifiable by their facial features and Western style clothing. They're playing at imported Western sports. The boys you see are balancing on stilts while the girls are skipping rope in the foreground. These games were totally new to Yoshikazu, and I think that his lack of familiarity shows. Just look closer at how he's depicted the jump rope in the foreground. It's snaking around the children's bodies in quite an awkward way. And if you've ever jumped rope before, you know the rope simply can't swing this way. So it seems to me that Yoshikazu's having some difficulty interpreting the details of the game. Another example of Japanese artists interpreting the new foreigners in their midst is this print Wild Geese Flying Down Toward Yoshida Bridge by Utagawa Yoshitora. It's also in the library at Kingscote. We know this is a Western couple because of their clothing and facial features. And the woman also rides her horse side saddle, an unknown custom in Japan. The couple is sightseeing in the vicinity of Mount Fuji, and a flock of geese beyond the print's left edge has momentarily captured their attention. But of course, what captures the attention of the Japanese artist is the viewers themselves rather than the view. Yoshitora and his native audience are much more interested in how the Westerners are watching nature than they are in the actual flight of the waterfowl, which Yoshitora doesn't even bother to picture. I think this print is brilliant because it comments on how Westerners were drawn to Japan as primarily a place of natural beauty. Think back to what I was saying earlier about how Gilded Age Americans felt nostalgic for a simpler pre-modern world. In Japan, Americans imagined they had found a purer, more innocent society, specifically one that was more in touch with nature. And this vision of Japan as a natural wonderland, a kind of Eden, persisted throughout the Gilded Age, despite the fact that Japan was changing with dramatic speed. In the 1850s and 1860s, Japan ratified a series of international treaties and opened treaty ports to foreign traders and diplomats. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 launched a far-reaching program of modernization and westernization that transformed the insulated feudal society into a modern industrial power. The new Meiji government embraced foreign technologies like the railroad, the telegraph, and the telephone. Here we see Yokohama in the late Meiji period, transformed by the telegraph, the streetcar, and Western style architecture in the background. In the late 19th century, Japan drafted a new constitution, modernized its army, opened public schools, and encouraged Westerners to live, do business, and travel in Japan. We know that Gertrude Vanderbilt of the Breakers and her husband Harry Payne Whitney honeymooned in Japan in 1896-7. These pictures of the couple were taken by a commercial photographer in Japan. They're a generous loan from Gladys and Paul Sapari. At the time these pictures were taken, there were hundreds of photographers in Japan, both foreign and Japanese, selling portraits, costume studies, as well as views of famous scenic sites to globetrotters. And I want to show you a closer view of Gertrude's kimono and obi sash, so you can see how they've been carefully hand tinted. Photography studios in Japan often employed as colorists, highly skilled Japanese artisans who had been trained in coloring woodblock prints. So this aspect of hand tinting reflects a long Japanese artistic tradition within the Western medium of photography, only recently imported into Japan. So this is a truly multicultural object, speaking to multiple visual traditions at the same time. The beginnings of this modern multicultural Japan are what we see in Yoshitora's and Yoshikazu's prints. But in artworks that Japanese artists produced for export to America, we usually don't see subjects like these. We don't see the new Japan of foreign merchants, foreign travelers, and burgeoning industry. We see a much more traditional, natural Japan. These beautiful stoneware vases in our collection are a great example of Meiji export wares. They're decorated with clouds and chrysanthemums growing in wild abundance. And other imagery we often see on Meiji exports are birds, insects, sea creatures, flowering trees, cracked ice, and thrashing rain. And that's because Meiji artists knew that Americans were drawn to Japan as a place of unspoiled nature. So they emphasized natural ornament as a way to appeal to Western tastes. They adopted anti-modern imagery to push their products overseas. By selling natural Japan to the West, Japanese artists could enhance their own country's economic standing, and thus its power among the modern Western nations. So paradoxically, kind of pushing pre-modern imagery is a way to kind of enter the world stage as a modern power. Japanese makers sent abroad an astonishing array of objects in this period, not just ceramics, but also lacquerware and cloisonné, fans, screens, silks, and prints. They used world's fairs to promote their manufactures abroad. This is Japan's display at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition of 1876. The Centennial gave millions of Americans their first glimpse of Japanese art, and it sparked a Japan craze that swept the nation. Philadelphia is where Americans really fell in love with Japanese art. They praised its beauty and truth to nature. They admired the high quality of Japanese craftsmanship, especially in contrast to what they viewed as the cheapness and uniformity that was characteristic of Western mass-produced goods. The Japanese eventually encouraged this perception that their makers preserved old artisan values that were disappearing in the industrial West. After the Centennial, Americans began voraciously collecting Japanese goods, and they also began producing arts and manufactures based on Japanese designs, a stylistic borrowing that scholars term Japanismo. An example is this elegant silver tea caddy produced by Tiffany and Company in New York. Stalks of bamboo dance across the front, cherry blossoms and a spider web adorn the back. Tiffany's use of space and form is also very Japanese. Tiffany's using really pronounced asymmetries, large areas of negative or empty space, and an overall emphasis on surface ornament. And that's all coming straight out of Japanese design. We believe this caddy was a wedding gift for Ella Louisa Reeves, who married David King Jr. of Kingscote in 1873. And that would make it the earliest known piece of hollowware that Tiffany produced in the Japanese style, and early overall for a work of American Japanisme predating the Philadelphia Centennial. So we're very lucky to have this important object in the collection of the Preservation Society. Cruising along, take a moment. Let's stop off next in medieval England, which wasn't so much a physical destination for American travelers in the Gilded Age as it was a spiritual one. This is another object that I feature in the Global Vistas exhibit online. It's a drawing by the architecture firm Cope and Stewardson for the main administration building at Washington University, designed in the English Gothic style. The drawing dates to the university's first great expansion period in the 1890s. During the Gilded Age, many of America's universities were growing both in size and stature. They were eager to rival England's ancient seats of learning, like Oxford, which you see on the right. And American schools needed an architecture to match their ambitions. It's at this point that WashU and other schools like Yale started building up their campuses with English Gothic architecture, turning medievalism into the look of American higher ed. Cope and Stewardson championed Gothic architecture, not just because it reminded them of English universities, but because they felt that Gothic architecture expressed certain valued principles. With its soaring spires and arches pointing heavenwards, Gothic architecture expressed the values of growth, aspiration, and development at the core of the mission of America's universities. In the proposal to WashU administrators, Cope and Stewardson wrote, "The Gothic says to the beholder, reach higher, spread outward and upward. There are no limitations." Their view of English Gothic architecture, and by extension medieval England, emphasized learning, freedom of thought, and spiritual and intellectual progress. And this is the result of their work at WashU. I should also mention that top universities at this time were still bastions for Americans of white Protestant Northern European ancestry. So medieval England was also the place where elite educated students and faculty could, for the most part, trace their own ancestry. And this is at a time when America more broadly was becoming increasingly diverse. This was a time of mass immigration to the US, with the arrival of millions of immigrant workers, primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe. So to be able to anchor the culture in medieval England was also a way to reject the newcomers who didn't share that same lineage. So there could be a nativist as well as a scholarly dimension to the English Gothic style in America. The scholarly view of the Middle Ages that made the Gothic appropriate for university architecture is also a feature of Alva and William K. Vanderbilt's Newport mansion, Marble House. You're looking at the Gothic Room in Marble House. The room was designed to display Alva's collection of medieval and Renaissance objects that she acquired from Parisian collector Emile Gavet. Most of that collection Alva later sold to circus impresario John Ringling for his Sarasota, Florida house and museum, though the Preservation Society has restored the room's original decorations. I should note that the Gothic Room didn't follow a particular national style. As Alva's friend Elizabeth Drexel-Lair said of Alva, quote, "Her enthusiasm was not backed by any real knowledge, so she assembled a heterogeneous collection of no particular period or country," end quote. With friends like this, who needs enemies? In addition to not having a national style, the Gothic Room also didn't have a clear function. The Vanderbilts used it mostly as a formal sitting room, but on the ground floor plan for the house by architect Richard Morris Hunt, the room was originally identified as a library. And that library designation reminds me of how closely Americans associated medievalism with scholarship and education, whether in the university setting or one's own private library. Today we tend to think of the Middle Ages as having been an ignorant, barbaric time, but that's not the view that prevailed in the Gilded Age. These modest bookends, relatively modest bookends from the Gothic Room, also connect Victorian book learning to the medieval world. They imitate pointed lancet windows, common in English and French Gothic architecture. But I wanted to show them because in other ways, these bookends are a totally modern object. I'm referring to the fact that bookends didn't even exist in the Middle Ages. Books were astoundingly expensive before the invention of mechanical printing, so very few people owned one book, let alone multiple to store together. Early libraries didn't have bookends either. They arranged books horizontally, as you see in the center of the print on the right. Only in the 17th and 18th centuries did books begin to be stored vertically. And the first L-shaped bookends, like our example on the left, were only patented in the Gilded Age in 1870. So bookends were a very modern technology. To own a bookend in this period was kind of like owning a Gothic computer or a Gothic cell phone today. And that's what I love so much about American medievalism in the Gilded Age. It's a creative pastiche of old and new, a reinvention of the past rather than a revival. And on that point, I'll just show you quickly this Gilded Age ladies' writing desk by New York furniture makers Kimball and Cabus. It's going to be in an exhibition opening this spring at Rosecliff titled Anything You Want, a new look at Newport's Gilded Age. In the coming months, I'm sure you'll hear more about this desk from our visiting curator for the show, Ulysses Dietz. But for now, I just wanted to preview it as an example of what was called the modern Gothic style. Like the bookends we just saw, this desk took inspiration from medieval designs, but was also considered very new and innovative or modern at the time. Now let's visit the Holy Land. In the Gilded Age, the term Holy Land referred to any part of the Middle East associated with the Bible, including modern-day Israel, Palestine, and parts of Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. American interest in this region surged during the Gilded Age. Scholars refer to it as Holy Land mania. American tourists in the Holy Land outnumbered visitors from all other nations. The European power struggle for control over what was then the declining Ottoman Empire had piqued Americans' fascination with both the region and its peoples. Another part of this attraction was that Americans thought of the US as a promised land and themselves as God's chosen people. And the belief that their country was divinely ordained, like a kind of New World Jerusalem, made Americans feel as if they had a special bond with the Holy Land. At the same time, though, recent scientific discoveries, particularly the evolutionary theories of Darwin, had begun to produce religious skepticism in the US. And as traditional religion was being challenged by science, many Gilded Age travelers wanted to go to the Holy Land to see with their own eyes the places of the Bible as a way of affirming biblical truth, as if they were on a kind of pilgrimage. You're looking at a photograph of one such biblical site. This photograph depicts the place in the village of Bethany near Jerusalem, where Christ raised Lazarus from the dead, according to the Gospel of John. It was taken by Chicago photographer Robert E.M. Bain. Bain traveled to the Holy Land in the 1890s to gather photographs for his book, Earthly Footsteps of the Man of Galilee, which documented places in Christ's life from his birth to the crucifixion. By retracing Christ's footsteps photographically, Bain wanted to bring his reader closer to God. He felt that photography could provide the visual evidence that Americans needed to believe again in the events of the Bible. And I think that in many ways, Bain's picture suggests to us that the Bible is real. First, take a look at the mother and infant on the left. I think that they're supposed to remind us of the Madonna and Child. They're supposed to actualize the Bible, actualize the Madonna and Child. And also notice how Bain structures this whole image around the shadowy cavity within the tomb. This dark, mysterious space within the picture suggests, I think, the presence of a spiritual realm that cannot be seen by the camera. In other words, it captures the idea of a spiritual sphere that exists beyond visibility. Bain's photograph also reflects American attitudes of the time towards Middle Eastern people. In the Gilded Age, there was a stereotype that the people of Palestine were primitive, whereas Americans saw themselves as very modern and innovative. Think about the implicit contrast Bain sets up here between the barefoot locals associated with ancient stones and Bain himself, who's at a distance, operating the very modern technology of the camera. Bain wants you to imagine that these people live as they did in the time of the Bible. And he also wants you to think that they're not particularly active folks. Here they're just kind of lounging around. And that captures another Orientalist stereotype, which was that Middle Easterners were supposedly more idle than Americans. The supposed lassitude of Middle Easterners contrasted with the vigor that Americans like to associate with their own country, and that Bain associated with his own travels. Throughout the text of Earthly Footsteps, Bain talked up how energetic and how adventurous he had to be to make it to all of these sites in the Holy Land. But what Bain doesn't tell us is that these people we see just lounging around his picture are actually hard at work as well. They're actively posing for Bain, which is, a job they would have negotiated payment for. So these men and women are working despite Bain's attempt to show them as if they're perpetually idle. I thought of this stereotype of the idle Middle Easterner just the other day when I was reading Thomas Wentworth Higginson's book, Old Port Days, about life in 19th century Newport. I was struck by Higginson's description of the city in winter as Middle Eastern in its inactivity. Higginson wrote, "If you wish for Syrian peace, immortal leisure, a place where no grown person ever walks rapidly along the street, and where few care enough for rain to open an umbrella or walk faster, come here." So the Middle East has become the lens through which Higginson understands his own sleepy home in Newport. I want to end our global tour at the Panama Canal, a place of enormous significance at the end of the Gilded Age. The American government gained total control over the Panama Canal zone in 1903 after intervening in Panama's struggle for independence from Colombia. Between 1904 and 1914, it spent over $500 million constructing the canal. The canal was by far the largest engineering project to date anywhere in the world. Its aim was to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and ensure the nation's dominance of global trade. The lithograph on your screen shows the closing stages of the canal's construction. It's by American printmaker Joseph Pennell, who traveled to Panama in 1912. He didn't want to miss his chance to document what he felt was one of the greatest achievements in American history. On site, Pennell made sketches using lithographic pencils and chalks. Those sketches were then sent to Philadelphia to be printed as a series of lithographs. But I think that the vigorous, really energetic lines you see in this print retain the spontaneity of Pennell's quickly drawn sketches. And I think that they also capture the impressive forces, both man and machine, put to work building the canal. So the energy you see in the kind of lines of the picture is a stand-in for the intense amount of energy involved in actually constructing the canal. We're looking specifically at the immense walls of the Pedro Miguel locks. You can see that they're spanned by arches, and Pennell likened those arches to flying buttresses supporting the ceilings of cathedrals. I think there's a cathedral-like quality to this soaring structure. The religious tone of Pennell's pictures really comes through, though, in another print showing workers being lifted by a giant crane. It's the end of the day, and they're now coming up from the pit to break for dinner. The men rise towards heaven in a burst of light, recalling biblical scenes of the ascension of Christ. I mentioned that traditional religion was in decline in the Gilded Age, but it seems that Pennell found a new subject to worship. He's worshiping here not God, but the awesome power of American engineering. Pennell doesn't seem to show the same reverence for individual workmen. His workers are always faceless and nameless. They're miniaturized here along the edge of the canal as if they were ants. By minimizing the workers, Pennell also ignores the plight of the workers, the fact that they suffered poor wages, exhaustion, and disease. Thousands of laborers died on this project. A more progressive artist would have shown that suffering. In fact, the plight of workers and labor unrest became legitimate subjects for fine art in the Gilded Age. An example is Robert Kohler's painting The Strike, showing the desperation of factory workers confronting their aristocratic boss. During the Gilded Age, workers across the country began to strike and unionize. They even tried to strike and unionize in Panama. The Gilded Age gave birth to the modern labor movement. But Pennell wasn't concerned about workers' issues or reform. His pictures are uncomplicated by class struggle. Pennell's lack of focus on the workmen also seems to express his unease with the people of color he encountered in Panama. Pennell celebrated the canal as, quote, the greatest American achievement of all time, although the labor force on the project was largely West Indian, recruited from Barbados and other islands. Pennell's pictures obscure such multiculturalism. Just because Pennell went to Panama doesn't mean that he was any less provincial in his outlook. I want to end with another artwork related to Panama. This photograph shows the fountain of El Dorado, completed by sculptor Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney for the Panama Pacific International Exposition held in San Francisco in 1915. It was a World's Fair that celebrated the opening of the Panama Canal. In Gertrude's bedroom at the Breakers today, you can see this photograph of the fountain's central relief. It's affixed to a larger screen shown at top right, displaying a number of Gertrude's public works. Countess Anthony Sapari created this screen, and Gladys and Paul Sapari have generously loaned it to the Preservation Society. The fountain's central panel, as you can see, shows two guardians at the gates of El Dorado. El Dorado was the mythical kingdom made of gold that European explorers searched for when they conquered the Americas. On either side of this central group, Gertrude placed two long sculptural friezes showing men and women rushing in vain pursuit towards the golden land. They struggle, they trample each other, some appear to fall down and die, all in a futile quest to reach El Dorado. By the Gilded Age, the term El Dorado was used metaphorically to describe any place where immense wealth could be obtained quickly. And in 1915, the year of the exposition, that meant Panama. Panama was the place where Americans thought they'd achieve commercial wealth and glory. There was no other place of such vast economic importance to the US. Panama was America's golden land. The opening doors on Gertrude's Fountain evoked the opening of the Panama Canal. And visitors to the San Francisco Exposition made that very same comparison. They wrote about how Gertrude's gates of El Dorado looked just like the opening gates of the canal. So why would Gertrude compare Panama to the mythical El Dorado? I think that she was critiquing her countrymen's foolhardy quest for fortune in Panama. She could have been troubled by news reports about the human toll of the canal project. She was above all a humanitarian. Gertrude also knew from personal experience that tremendous wealth would never bring happiness. Gertrude was born with enormous privilege, but also felt stifled by restrictions on women of her class. She endured a calamitous marriage to someone of similarly high-born status. She was disenchanted with her privilege, and she ultimately bucked it all to work as a professional artist and found a modern art museum. So Gertrude knew better than anyone. It wasn't worth chasing wealth and power, not in Panama, and perhaps not in any foreign land where the US sought to extend its influence in the Gilded Age. So I think that's probably a good lesson to end on. Thank you so much for taking this global tour with me. And thanks also for your very warm welcome over these last few weeks at the Preservation Society.
Thank you, Nikki. That was wonderful. And I think, well, I certainly appreciate the perspective that you bring from the exhibition that you developed. And we welcome everyone to issue their comments and their questions in the Q&A feature. I think one of the areas that we should touch upon is, how did people get to these places? Travel was very different than it is today, something we constantly need reminders of. And particularly if one were to try and sail from New York to Venice, in modern times, it usually takes about 12 to 15 days with stops. But, conventional sail ships that would have been, and even steam powered ships that would have been taking people like the Vanderbilts on these great journeys, it was a huge investment of time and something that they were also incredibly proud of. I'm sure with Nikki's research, and she might be able to comment on this as well, the level of, I guess, personal pride that one would take in making these journeys. They would have reports sent back specifically to local and national newspapers to keep the local public updated on the travels that they were seeing. And Nikki, I don't know if you can speak to that as part of your research.
Well, you mentioned it required an incredible output of time. It also required an output of money. It wasn't cheap to travel to Europe or anywhere else in the world back then, which is why I wanted to open the stereophotography, because in a way, stereophotography and the burgeoning visual culture of this time more broadly, this is also a time when visual culture is exploding in many different forms. So this is an era of lantern slides. This is an era of chromolithography, photography, stereophotography. All of these modes democratize the process of travel. If you couldn't fork out to get on an ocean liner and sail across the Atlantic, you could go to your local art or bookstore. You could buy prints of foreign subjects. You could attend lantern slide presentations. You could purchase a stereoscope. The stereoscope that I actually showed everyone from Chateau-sur-Mer, I'll go back to it now, was actually a pricey example. This one is made of burled wood and ivory, but stereoscopes came in much more rudimentary forms made out of tin. So they were available to domestic consumers of modest means. So, any middle class or upper class consumer in the Gilded Age could afford to travel virtually through the stereoscope. So I was trying to think about travel not just as a physical experience, but also as a kind of imaginative one during the Gilded Age.
Yeah. We have a question about did the arrival of millions of immigrants to the U.S. affect the art of the Gilded Age? And I think that that's a pretty powerful assessment to make, because our visual culture does change dramatically with the influx of a variety of cultures that end up making up what American culture is. And Nikki, if you want to speak to sort of, again, the quest for Americans to define their own culture as a part of these journeys.
Yeah, I mean, so many of the major artists of this time are immigrants themselves. You know, someone I think of immediately is Albert Bierstadt, who's a German immigrant. You know, I think that what one early 20th century critic called the immigrant gifts to American life are so many and so varied that there's no way we can possibly account for them. I featured in this exhibit, you know, I mentioned in this exhibition how medieval England emerges for some as a kind of reactionary, kind of nativist strategy for kind of regrounding American life in English history. But in many other ways, you know, American art was immigrant contributions to American art were just so multifarious that, you know, no virtual lecture could possibly encompass them.
Absolutely. There's a question, and almost in a way a comment, about the relationship between architecture of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum and the Gilded Age interest in Venice. And I think that absolutely there is a Venetian influence in that architecture, and also a Gothic influence too. I don't know, Nikki, if you can speak to that at all.
Yeah, you know, I hadn't thought in particular about the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, but the Gothic architecture and Venice are integrally intertwined. You know, I presented these spaces in my lecture, in my exhibition, as discrete locations, but they're all porous and fluid and overlapping. So, you know, Ruskin is interested in Venice primarily because of its Gothic era architecture. You know, he saw Gothic architecture as an inspired kind of architecture, in contrast to the kind of modern architecture that seemed to him to be too controlled by rule and line. He contrasted the inspirational craftsmen who constructed these Gothic buildings with the kind of oppressed factory workers in English factories who were just producing things according to very specific specifications. So the inspiration of the Gothic architecture of Venice emerges in contrast to the kind of alienation of factory workers in England. That's to say that the Gothic, you know, the idea of the Gothic England, the medieval period more broadly, is so much a part of the story of Venice in this time. Other ways that these places overlap in the Gilded Age, you know, I would just say that Japan as well was conceived of as a medieval society, and Japanese craftsmanship was considered to be as inspired as Gothic craftsmanship. And commentators at the time constantly compared the craftsmanship of the Japanese to the inspired craftsmanship of medieval England. So these places are all, you know, these sites are fluid and they overlap. Really, my kind of organizational scheme was more of a hermeneutic for purposes of the show. But I'm so glad we had the opportunity to emphasize how these spaces all connect with each other.
Yeah, and I think we're going to end on this one last question, which I think is really interesting. So this person has always been interested by the replication in America of Italian prototypes, American railroad stations, the Siena City Hall Tower. They even mentioned the Pilgrim Memorial in Provincetown, which is almost simultaneous with the anti-Catholic, anti-Italian xenophobia with immigration influx. So do you have any thoughts, Nikki, on how Americans separated admiration from scorn?
Yeah, it was a toxic brew. You know, there was so much, you know, I will say that it's a blurry line between emulation and appropriation. And you know, we see that we see Americans taking a kind of cosmopolitan outlook, and there's a way that we could think about that instead as as I mentioned in the talk, as a form of appropriation. So that's, I guess, to address one aspect of that question. The matter of Italy more broadly. You know, I chose to focus on Venice because Venice really emerges in the late 19th century as the single most important site in the American imagination for tourists, for American tourists in particular. But Rome was also really important at this time. You know, there was a colony of American sculptors in Rome, particularly women sculptors, Harriet Hosmer, Edmonia Lewis. Rome was a space of incredible creative efflorescence. Americans had also always been fascinated by Rome because of the idea of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. You know, they were all readers of Edward Gibbon. They all understood that empires rise and fall. But one fascinating aspect of American cultural beliefs in the Gilded Age was that they thought of themselves as exceptional. You know, they looked at an example like Rome and said, empires rise and fall, but our empire will never fall. This is, you know, an idea of American exceptionalism permeated much of the visual culture I showed tonight. So Rome is also a key space throughout the 19th century, and arguably, you know, still today, if you know, you're still a believer, if you still believe that, you know, America is going to be a global power forever. I don't know, you know, there's these questions are all still in the headlines.
Well, and I think it's also important to remember that at that time, Italy was not a united country yet. So these were also sort of looked at as, I mean, while they were, they didn't have a united language as well. So they were looked at as separate domains. And even Florence, to that point too, you have Richard Morris Hunt and the Vanderbilts replicating Florentine aesthetics and culture with the building of the Breakers, which was far different from many of the other Gothic inspired buildings, French as well, here in Newport. So lots to visually feast on tonight in tonight's lecture, as well as if you are all able to join us here in Newport, if you live here or are lucky enough to live here with us. Thank you, Nikki, so much for this presentation. Thank you all for joining us. Again, please stay tuned to our upcoming email announcements. We look forward to seeing you again in our upcoming lectures. And thank you for your support. Have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.